start by welcoming everybody and to our first in this year's series of Walkative events. This is Walkative Los Angeles, another virtual walk. We have a number of people with us that I'd like to introduce before we get to Norman. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Alistair Klein, who is one of the presidents for Walkative, and Wing Sean Wong, who will also be a president this year for the Walkative Society. And alongside them on the panel is Hannes Brunner, who you may remember from our previous walks. He led the walk in the Marshall Islands, and of course, co-founder of Walkative, Simon King, who will be keeping a close eye on the chat box and asking maybe for any clarification if you have questions along the way, and making sure that we're all on track and everyone's included in the discussion as we continue with our walk. So just a few things before we get started. You'll see in the chat box that I've pasted in a couple of links. The first link is to our YouTube channel, which has recordings of all of the previous walks that make up the Cities in Lockdown series. There's also a link to the City and Image YouTube channel, and Norman and me have been sort of warming up for this event with a series of discussions about key areas of Norman's research, but also areas that we've both been working on and collaborating around in terms of kind of themes. If you have time, or if you're interested in finding out more about topics such as scripted space, the history of the future, parallel urbanisms, parallel worlds, or infrastructure space, all in relation to Los Angeles, there's a number of talks on there.
Jasper, just quickly, I don't think it's on the in the chat box. You just post it again.
Oh, is it not?
No.
It should be. I can see it here. I'll post it again if it's not there. All of this, if you can't see it now, I'll post it again. It's showing up in my chat box.
Suzanne Kohler says that she can't see it, and Tim Durfee.
Okay.
Can't see it.
That's
so.
odd. Okay, well, look, I can see it, but I'll post it again just to make sure. But when I do post it again, there's another link, or actually it's not a link, it's just information. It's a discount code for, you can see Simon's holding up the new edition of Walking Cities London. And if you are thinking of buying it, you can use that code to get a 20% discount. I think it might even be more. Anyway, on with the walk tonight, which is led by Norman Klein. Just a few words about Norman Klein. I first came into contact with Norman's work when I was finishing my PhD, and I was looking at his book, from the Vatican to Vegas, A History of Special Effects. And in that book, he talks about this idea of scripted space, and this became particularly interesting and useful for my research. And I had the opportunity to travel to LA and meet Norman and find out more about his other publications and his research. He found the time to meet me, and also then we started working together on a few publications. He traveled to the UK for a conference on video works and curation, and it's been a kind of ongoing discussion about Los Angeles. But what's particularly important at the moment, I suppose, is the US election as a sort of backdrop to all of these talks. And this evening or morning LA time, I guess it's on everyone's mind. So no doubt we will have that somehow as part of our shared consciousness on this walk. Norman obviously has published widely. You have his bio, a whole number of books that deal with the history of Los Angeles and also the future of Los Angeles, thinking very much about its kind of its relevance in terms of kind of global politics and culture, but also in relation to urbanism and media studies. I think it's probably a good time to hand over. And like I say, before I do, just please put any questions or any comments in the chat. We'll keep this informal. The idea of the walks, the Walkative virtual walks, is that they have a kind of discursive quality. So hopefully we'll be able to chat along the way, Norman, if that's okay with you.
You can interrupt me at any time. I interrupt myself, so it's fine.
Yeah, you. We'll try. Okay, so over to you, Norman. Thank you.
And I'm sorry that my eyes are gleaming. I have the second screen to look at, and I've been trying desperately to let that screen not bounce off of my glasses. But then if I take off my glasses, I can't read. So you'll have to forgive my glow, right? And take it as some sort of cyborg reference or whatever. And I'll start with a few images quickly, and then get to the talk. I think that would make the most sense. And then in the introduction, I mentioned the term archipelago in the description of the Walkative, and maybe I should just briefly explain what that means. Is that there are a lot of myths about cities, and one myth about LA is that it's singularly held together by its circulation, and therefore it has no neighborhoods. Woody Allen makes these jokes about being able to actually walk with your feet on the ground, right? This kind of thing. But historically, LA actually is a series of about 65 or more little towns that joined this river city and expanded out. And so LA actually is strangely becoming more and more like other cities like New York or even London, having lots of little pocket neighborhoods. And it's completely rearranged itself, except now we have the COVID problem, and we don't know what the next change will be. And I'm being asked to constantly talk about what's going to happen next, as we all are, right? But first we have to understand what happened in the last, let's say, 40 years, rather than try to summarize the history of the city too much. When Los Angeles became quite different than what it was before, and some of this archipelago effect came back, as it did all around the world. Globalization, as we know, is really localization. It's regionalized, it's created nativistic paranoias, it's more kind of emergent post-industrial industrial feudalism than actually a global thing. It's more like 17th or 18th century mercantilism, which was more disastrously confused than people want to remember. The Dutch and British East India Company were disastrous piratical monsters, right? Who in fact were not helping the crown. And we're back to that. So, and LA, as like London, is caught in the middle of it. So let me show you just a few images, just to be evocative. Talks are often evocative more than precise, but I'll try to be both. But at least start with evocative, you know. Let me see. And then I have the right, I believe. Let's see, is that, let me see if that's, oh, can you see? Oh, no, not yet. Okay, share, okay. Is there a single screen?
Yes.
Okay, it's rather strange the way it looks, but we'll make sense of it. These are the ports of Los Angeles, and saying they handle 70% of American West Coast container traffic is only part of it. It's at least something like 40% of the entire nation, and something like 40% of all the Chinese materials and goods and so forth. It's part of this gigantic distribution system that basically was built out of the American occupation in Asia, from Japan to Vietnam. So in a way, globalization is almost the inversion, right, of the American occupation. in Asia in particular, because the Atlantic trade was already there. As we know, it's the Pacific side that really has been so enormously different, right? I mean, it's no surprise that there were cars from Germany selling so well, but when the cars from Japan came, it was a shockwave for the auto industry. Anyway, but there are two ports, and you can see how they're separated, Los Angeles and Long Beach. And they're quite large and quite useless in some ways originally. What happened is Los Angeles hated San Francisco. San Francisco interests bought land where the port should have been in Santa Monica. So they moved 20 miles south, fought San Francisco for 15, 20 years, and then in 1913 got their own port dredged. But it also means you could dredge as much as you want because there's no natural harbor there. So in a strange way, the fact that it was nothing made it something, because you could always make it into anything. And so right now, I'm not sure, something like 30 million containers a year, starting in the late 70s forward. And it gives you a sense of the size of it. But this map might be more interesting. Can you see, am I pulling down? Is this working? As I pull down, can you see? Because this is how big the ports would be in Manhattan. The whole northern end of Manhattan would be simply the port. It gives you a sense of the scale of it. And then in the 1990s, they found an old abandoned right-of-way from the trains that had initiated the city in the 1870s and 80s. The city grew out of two railroads that basically merged and created a real estate boom, and then other complications afterward. And then this oligarchy, about 50 or 100 men who dominated the city and kept investments inside, right? And built this remarkable infrastructure and built the city from 15,000 in 1885 to 1 million in 1923. And the old what if question is, if they weren't there, would it have happened? Probably not, but who can say? Anyway, so out of one of the old rights of way, they built what's called the Alameda Rail Corridor. And it doesn't seem like very much. You drive past it and think, what the hell is that? Some trains and trucks. But you don't realize that 6 to 7 million containers a year go through that. And that it's all the way from 20 miles from the port all the way near downtown in that very strange town of Vernon, which is used for murder mysteries. It's a good place to kill someone in the movies. There was one whole year, one TV show just had a murder there, and they didn't even have to put sets or anything. It just looked weird enough, you know, that kind of thing. But then from Vernon, those 20 miles, it goes another 30 miles in two different directions and splays out. And then it goes up to 70 miles and then finally up to 2,000 miles. So the shipping of these, all this is just an extraordinary new arterial system that's been added to Los Angeles. What's important about it is that LA fell to pieces in the 1990s because it lost the aerospace business that was so dominant and was the largest employer. And even though LA was a big manufacturing hub and so forth, and all that was there, losing its major employer was terrible, and it was replaced by this. So if ever there's a city that was remade by globalization, it's LA, right? And I'm not saying Hong Kong and Singapore and London and Amsterdam and so forth, right? Rotterdam, and so many cities have also been. These coastal cities take on a very strange quality. So LA, in a sense, left its mid-century modernism and replaced it with a kind of globalist affect. And as in every city we know, the impact of globalization is to increase inequality, create tremendous precarity of labor, a lot more gig jobs and part-time jobs and contract jobs. And it happened as well. So every city has been, in a sense, becoming more segregated by class as well as race. And while it looks like things are very cool and you could buy all this wonderful ethnic food, actually, the truth is it's becoming a much more segregated world, especially in the coastal cities. So LA changed for various reasons like that. And this is what the port looked like, right? In the 1920s, rather early, with this separation. And then just as a little anecdote, this is a neighborhood called Bunker Hill that was added as a kind of brow that looked out toward the ocean. And it was a very fancy neighborhood. And you could actually see the ocean from downtown because LA is basically the LA region is 3 dried ancient lakes. So if you're high enough off the lake, you can get a view of the ocean. Very nice. And this is a tunnel that was underneath, the same tunnel that was used in Terminator 2, right? This is the first cars going through and so on. But the entire neighborhood was then torn down in the 60s and became a kind of classic story. This is one of the buildings that was looking pretty rotten, but also is very close to where they shot Kiss Me Deadly. That's kind of interesting to think of that movie and think of all that goes with it. But there were also other things. For example, there was a tunnel left where there had been a subway. The subway was only a mile long, and it was a special route. It was called the Hollywood route. You went from downtown to the Hollywood area through a neighborhood that we identify with, like Echo Park and so forth around there. And when it finally was torn down in 1958, it changed the liner information on the front of the trolley from Hollywood line to Oblivion. So there's this famous photograph of this trolley going through Oblivion, and then this particular leftover, right? As you can see, right? It lasted for a long time. It's still there in a way, and it was a mile long. Eventually, it was about a half a mile long because they dropped buildings in there, and it became the capital of graffiti for California, and became a very strange place because they played this game from Michoacan in Mexico that was a pre-conquest, an ancient ball game. I don't know what the original purpose of it was. So you had a very strange thing. You had all of these graffiti people, right? You had families with their babies. You had people playing this ancient pre-conquest game, and then they start to shoot movies there. Predator 2 was shot there. So it was a place to drop alien ships in movies, and then they start to do videos there. And you always have to be careful because the feral dogs were so loud. Anyway, this has all been cleaned up and turned into a neo-Tuscan Las Vegas style apartment building. So it goes on and on and on. And this over here below is another area, one of these neighborhoods that are like Tribeca or like the neighborhoods in any city where a lot of the loading docks for the city were, and then they became abandoned.
Norman, did they shoot Roger Rabbit there as well?
Well, not to my knowledge. Oh my God, could that be? I don't know. I can't say no with absolute conviction. I wrote about Roger Rabbit, but it never occurred to me.
I think they might have, yeah. Anyway, I'll have a look.
Oh, how interesting. Wouldn't that be? Okay, I'll have to check that. All right, Roger Rabbit. I'll see if I can confirm that. But it was at that time that it became very, very sexy. I used to give people tours of it. I remember one time I gave a person a tour who was an architectural expert, PhD, and he was very much a hardline materialist. And then he called me and he said, "My camera is infected by ghosts." I said, "No, it's not ghosts. It's the reflection of the moisture in the ceiling. That's where the word grotesque comes from."
Norman, Max Harper is saying that it definitely looks like the Roger Rabbit tunnel.
Oh, okay. Okay, we'll check. Then let's say we can, with 25% absolute conviction, say it is the Roger Rabbit tunnel, right? And then okay, Max and I will just check it out, and then we'll let everyone know for certain. But it was this very famous site. I would take people here all the time. By the way, the Germans loved it. The last time I took some Germans there, they looked for all these spray cans. They gathered them in bags. They look for pieces of the graffiti. And they actually, I was wondering what they did. Did they sell them in an auction or something? I don't know, but the Germans love this. So part of the issue of the ruin of mid-century modernism became gradually a piece of the myth from Blade Runner forward. So you go from the myth of the city of circulation to the city of a special kind of decay. But then on the very bottom right, that little photo indicates what they did with the so-called arts district, which no artist could live in and very few artists could sell in. But you see the layers, it's almost like China, like Shenzhen or something. Layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. You can see the historical layers of being built. And it's like Tribeca, it's becoming incredibly expensive real estate. But once again, as we know, all of these culturally oriented neoliberal sites are endangered now, right? Or something's going to change. We just don't know how much. We just don't know what's going to happen. I mean, in London is no different. Berlin is no different, right? All of them are changing. And then this is the image around Disney Hall, which is this incredibly misplaced thing. It's almost like something left some luggage there. You know, it's this shiny piece of luggage in the middle of nothing in downtown. But this is the plan to finish it. And I mean, how glamorously useless, I have to say, Frank Gehry aside, right? If this is going to be his last gift to the world, it looks like a shopping center opened like a melon out into the sunlight. You know, it really has this very strange effect. But then we have to remember what the image of this globalized LA has been. This is the final scene from the movie Her, where in order to make LA look like the future, they shot part of the skyline in Shanghai along that big bridge, where one side is very 30s looking and very, very dull and, I don't know, European concessions with public buildings. In fact, when I was there was a big Santa Claus everywhere. And I asked them what the Santa Claus was doing in China. And they said, well, isn't that the symbol of shopping in December? And I said, yeah, that's close enough. But on the right side, they have all these famous buildings and needle buildings, skyscrapers. So it's actually the two cities blended together. So LA has this ultimate sort of digitized, algorithmic, globalized monster, right? Very, very cute, very, very charming and so on. But the actual city itself was built by trolleys. So it's not the freeways that built it. This gives you a sense as to how huge the trolley system was. You could actually go up to 30, 40 miles by trolley. It was finished by about 1911 to 12. And this balloon route over here was the only way to get to the beach, basically, by trolley. It's an extraordinarily complex system. It was torn down in the 50s and 60s. They might say mid-century modernism did some terrible things. It ruined the river. It tore down. I mean, it's a little bit like what's happening to universities with the end of books. You have a bear, you take the skeleton out of the bear, and you're left with an octopus, right? So LA became a kind of octopus replaced by freeways, but you can imagine how many small towns there were. This is just an area around, it's called Edendale. Edendale was the name of, it says Glendale. Oh, it says Glendale. So Glendale and Burbank, right, in the 1940s, showing how charming they were, right? They were also the capital of the manufacturing for airplanes. So you can see a very integrated world from the trolley that was simply torn down. Look at the scale of it. My God.
These are beautiful and charming. That's the word that was in my head. These maps.
Yeah, they were evocative. I thought I picked them. They speak to them for themselves, don't they?
Absolutely.
And you can imagine each of the streets and how it would. In fact, let me see. Wait, I'll be right back if I can find it. Can you see just the title. Secret stairs. These are secret walkways. LA is filled with stairways that go into corners and twisted turns. The reason why there are so many, one of the reasons was that if you could prove that one part of the stairs attached you to one of the trolleys, you could build it. So they have stairways that go all over the place. The stairway that's in my neighborhood, Highland Park, was renamed by this socialist suffragette. And so it has only socialist names. So you're walking up and you have all these references to famous socialists in American labor movements. So it's very strange, but the extraordinary culture between that, and then of course, the river was huge. The river is actually not so much a river as a branching system, like a giant chandelier of water that covers about 800 square miles. In other words, let's say maybe 2.5 times the size of New York City is the size of the whole watershed. So, and it was all removed. It was diverted, moved around, and so forth. Once in a while, I know these people. I know this guy lives in Pasadena whose house was diverted, the water underneath, and then when it rains too much, it explodes into his house. So he comes home and there's like 2 feet of water in his living room, and he just doesn't know where the hell does it come from. So in a sense, LA had a city that was a bit more like a city we might know and don't, and now it's becoming that, and now the shock is it's changing yet again. Many changes, and so on. But I'll stop sharing. Not that I don't like to share, right? But it seems I just don't want to make it seem like some Netflix documentary. I think I'll just talk. First I'll cough, right? So let's see. And then I talk about the boosters and so on. So by the 1980s, Los Angeles has abandoned its mid-century modern plan that was supposed to be concentric with multimodal connections and no downtown. But there was a downtown up until that was very centered until about the 1920s. Then during the Second World War, it finally industrialized because it had been primarily agricultural and light industry, and then always real estate and some degree of shipping. But then it became the second largest manufacturing hub in the country, and the engine for the war. It was a secret weapon against Japan, you might say, and it continues afterward. And there's so many odd places in strange suburban areas of the city where you see odd plants blocking everything, and then you go in and find out that they were building bombs there for 30, 40 years. When there was an earthquake, CalArts got cracked in two where I teach, and we had to move into one of these sites, and one part of the building would rumble every few hours. You never knew what it was. Just and then it would stop. And there were large of shower heads all over the building, which meant that people walking on with chemical suits and so forth. And there was no signage, nothing, just tall plants, that kind of thing. So the scale was difficult to understand, but the rewiring of the city around this port globalization was one answer. Then the hub part of it developed, as in all cities, like London also, right? And Berlin was split in two anyway, so it's rather easy for Berlin to stay split. But cities are beginning to form hubs because the transportation is not secure, and something about this whole process has changed it. So LA became, instead of like a concentric circulation, it became more like separate hubs, 3 or 4 hubs, maybe 5 or 6 even, of about 800,000 people repeating the same things. So you have this. So basically, you are 20 minutes away from everything. I never see the beach. Why would I go to the beach? That's like on another planet. I don't go to the beach. I never drive more than 15 minutes for anything. I'm living in a little town of about 400,000 people inside a region of 18 million. which seems to be the new process. And I think with the changes going on, the supply chains for light industry connected with globalization, in other words, the assemblies, the fenders for cars, the repairs will no longer be coming from China, wherever. They'll be much tighter in. In Europe, I think that's already happened. But with the supply chains tightening, we're going to have all sorts of odd twists and turns in how merchandise moves and so on. It's going to change the life of the city, right? But I think cities are going to become even more local than they were before. But what that means, I don't know, because all these cute little stores that were run by people who didn't want to work in the gig economy anymore, they're going to die out. So I don't know what's going to happen to the so-called precariat. This guy standing, he made this whole campaign using that term. So we have so many changes happening, and the cultural changes are even larger. We're in a profession as professors where we just fold our arms and look back and comment on how terrible the world is. Now we fold our arms, look back, and there's an infrared laser sight on our forehead that we're actually targeted. This time, the university has neoliberal monster problems and a huge crisis in the US that 70% of the faculty in the US are now part-time, and a third of them at least are living below the poverty line. So you have now PhD people below the poverty line in the universities or colleges, wherever. So since a lot of these cities have huge, infrastructures of hospital workers and university people, we have no idea what's going to come of that, right? How will people be able to afford anything? London had this crazy business where 3 people could buy an apartment together or something. I don't know, some crazy system. I don't know. Berlin has been cheap, but is not as cheap as it used to be. We're witnessing a hinge that will be studied for the next 300 years. I even say as a joke that in the future, children will dress up as Americans for Halloween. So you open at the door and there'll be little Trumps with bags screaming trick or treat, this kind of thing.
Norman, can I just ask a quick question, just in relation to what you were saying about these hubs and the idea of a kind of new feudalism that is part of a new kind of city structure, which is to do with an emphasis on this kind of placemaking of the local, the kind of village, the local village or farmers market or whatever, however you call it, that you see happening in areas, especially you see that in LA. What impact does this have in terms of the walking, I suppose, because in a way we associate Los Angeles with cars. We think of it as a city where you don't really walk, but is that changing with this shift that you're describing?
Oh yeah. I mean, people are walking along, people have bicycles, and only downtown LA are there people who don't have cars. Most people have cars still, but yes, I think because of this small patterning of little towns, it's possible to walk around much more. And there are, because of all these crazy paths that LA has, and because it's crenulated with canyons, there are actually a lot of nice walks you can take. So LA is becoming more pedestrian oriented than it was, put it that way. And it does have this new trolley system to replace the other, but it's only 1/4 the size of what it was when it had a population of 350, 400,000. So now it has a population of over 12 million that have to be serviced, so 10 million. So between, let's say, 600,000 and 10 million, and you play with the math and you realize this thing is not good enough. The interurban systems are being built, but the street-to-street systems will not be built. So people are beginning to find a much closer way of operating. So I would say probably LA is friendlier to walking than it used to be. My son summarized it this way, and I think it was the best I ever heard. He said, LA and New York have a lot in common if you leave out Manhattan. So a lot of the neighborhoods in LA are approximately 100 years old, which is approximately when a lot of the Brooklyn neighborhoods developed. And I grew up in Brooklyn, and I have this terrible deja vu sometimes. I'm sitting eating, and I have this Brooklyn shockwave, like I'm still 9 years old or something. But the buildings do look like almost the same scale. So I think the emphasis on LA as a freeway city is going to become less and less important. And as you know, almost everyone's moving to LA not to be in cars, right? I mean, so many New Yorkers for a time before LA became more expensive, right, would rush, right? And even Londoners would rush to LA because it had a little of that flavor, right? Even when we first met, I took you to some neighborhoods and local bars. And I remember there was this German bar, the Dresden bar, that you loved so much because they sang really off-key Sinatra tunes and so forth. And then you took other friends to see it. And there was a bookstore nearby and some theaters, a little pocket of about 3 or 4 streets, typical LA. So LA has, in a sense, a kind of globalized substructure, you know, whatever you want to call it. And then, of course, LA is now the most ethnographically mixed city in America. That may be changing soon because the immigration is slowing down, but it's just extraordinary. It's the second or third largest city in Mexico. It's the second or third largest city in Korea. It's the largest city in Armenia, because there are almost no cities in Armenia, I guess. But the jokes are just relentless. But the mix has generated also, you know, pockets, right? Ethnographic pockets that are different than, let's say, New York was in the day, right? But you could feel it, and it creates more of this, right? Generative quality. So I'd say LA is more of a walking city than it used to be, but statistically, maybe people will say no. Maybe there's some scientific way to find out that it's not true, but it feels that way.
Norman, I have a question from Hannes. Maybe Hannes, you'd like to ask it.
Yes, please. Oh, no, it's, you're out, there you go.
I just had the question, when you talked about the trolley system, which I found really interesting, and actually as I experienced the last time I was in LA, yeah, there's this beautiful, sophisticated trolley line. But yeah, the question is really when you install a system like this, and it's just one, I think there are just 2 lines, and yeah, you serve like a population of nobody. No, I mean, how actually one deals with a system like this when it's just not even serving the population?
I agree. I mean, the crisis is, okay, so they have sort of like bits and pieces, right? But you still can't get, like, I decided I would trolley to work. I'm 40 miles from work. So I had to have my wife drive me to the trolley station because there was no way directly to get it. Then I had to take the trolley, but then there was no bus from the trolley to work. So I had to take a lift from there. So if I had my wife drive me, then I took the trolley and then took a lift, I could get to work.
Right.
And of course, and then the trolley stopped at 7:30. So I had to rush like a lunatic to take the trolley back because of the classes. It's not workable yet. And I don't see that they'll ever catch up. So the transportation problems for LA, and they're not so great in London either, right? I mean, London Underground is so expensive, and I don't know what, but at least there's some spine there. When LA tore down, right, a system that large, it was 1,100 miles of track, 1,100 miles. When you tear down something that large, you can't just put it back. It's not like, well, I'll take that egg salad sandwich after all. You know, it doesn't work that way. And so yes, the crisis is partly why the hubs are growing even faster, because LA can't solve it. And also the freeway system was based on population models that changed. In other words, the valley areas, the suburb areas and the valleys, and then the beach areas grew much faster than the projections. So of course, they became like impacted wisdom teeth, like molars stuck there. And I remember an expert telling me once that if you add an extra lane to a freeway, you get 5 years. I said, what do you mean? He said, isn't that plain enough? In 5 years, the problem is pretty much as it was. So that there's almost no clear solution. We'll have to see. I wonder whether the Lyft and Uber situation where you use the computer, right, and the internet to come up with some kind of short line Walkative type of thing like in Mexico City. I have a feeling that that may be the only solution. That we have to rely on something like vans and cabs and so forth handled through the internet.
I have some.
Sorry, can you just mentioned Mexico City? I'm not
Walkative
familiar with the system in Mexico City.
Yeah, have little vans that hold about 10 or 15 people, and they're often ready to blow up or something like that because they're not, let's say, properly looked over, right? But it's interesting because then you can, for not much money, have an alternative, because the subway in Mexico City is very lovely. It looks very French. It's got rubber wheels, and so is the LA subway, rather pretty, the trolley, but it's not enough. I mean, for a city of 23 million people, it's ridiculous. So that they have these other alternatives, and one of them is these little vans.
I'm just getting something from Kay Yolland. Hi, Kay. Do you want to ask your question directly or make your point? She says that I believe Elon Musk is working on an underground multi-level highway.
Yes.
Is he also working on trams and public transport?
Yes, he's working on everything. I think he's working on how to add extra penises and how to fly to the moon and so forth. I mean, there seems to be no end to his ego, right? And maybe some of it will happen. There is this idea that maybe you can go underground. The problem with underground in LA is that LA was the capital of the oil industry in the US for a time because it has so much underground oil, which also means natural gas, which means these tunnels maybe could work until they blow up. Because trying to remove natural gas is much more complicated, as all the fracking experts will tell you, right? It can be done, but it's not so easy. So they'll basically have to frack their way across through Los Angeles. But something will have to be done. The crisis, the COVID crisis, is forcing us to actually go back to the 30s and 40s and invent a new kind of modernism. So you might say we're going to have a 21st century modernism. The nation state's going to have to get larger to step in. Private industry is obviously failing. So who knows? Maybe Elon Musk will come up with something that works. And there are also stories. The LA River was cemented over and repurposed underneath it. All the aquifers, they only get about 5 or 10% of the water back, which is a little low.
Norman, can I just comment on something about the nature of your walk that you're taking us on around LA? And I'm curious about, and it happens often with discussions around LA, and when you visit, you often get caught up in this idea of infrastructure space. And there aren't many other cities where infrastructure space is quite so embedded or entwined with a kind of cultural output
Yes.
or image of the city. We don't really speak about other cities in that same way. But somehow when we talk about LA, we talk about, you know, the highways, we talk about the relationship with a kind of lost trolley system or the rivers, you know, but they also feature, I mean, like when you showed the tunnel is part of a kind of infrastructure space, but it's also a space, you know, like in the comments, you know, for a number of films, including, you know, Back to the Future and things like that, you know, so this kind of intermeshing of or coexistence of infrastructure space with culture, I think it's sort of fascinating. But but as infrastructure space changes, as you've described, it sort of seems to mark a change in the kind of cultural output of the city too.
I agree, and I'm trying to guess what that is. there's another little secret that you wouldn't know. If you go down to this new, glorified, fancy, highly segregated downtown, the new fancy one, underneath in the 1990s, in the transition, they put in fiber optic cables. Then in the course of the 90s, when the Bell system was declared a monopoly, MCI was one of these big phone companies, so they leased a whole piece of a building to contact with the fiber optic cables and set up a phone system that would be faster. And then other companies did as well, until finally now the entire continent of Asia goes right through downtown in about 12 buildings, 10 buildings. So the downtown has become a hub all the way from the beach. And they actually, apparently, someone showed me where the line from India meets one of the beach towns. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's strange how many layers, have been added. There is a software industry they call Silicon Beach that's connected with the Hollywood industry. So we're also witnessing new kinds of, if you want to call it infrastructure, algorithmic infrastructure.
Mm.
I mean, because of the scale of LA, it's very easy for it to take on, a new grid or something. And because it's relatively flexible, right? It happens more quickly here.
Just a quick point, and I'll stop going on. But just a quick point about that idea of layers. It's sort of interesting because it's and Hannes may have something to say about this, but it's, you think of Berlin as having these same kind of layers, or even London, but they're much more to do with kind of cultural and political movements that have impacted on the city. Whereas with LA, you think about those layers as kind of layers of infrastructure space, described, as these ecologies. Is a kind of very particular type of layering, isn't it?
I think it's fair to say that LA goes through cultural changes almost at the same time that it's reconfigured, almost like a giant machine. But that's partly because of the way it was originated through this booster system, as they called it, these 50 or 100 wealthy men who controlled the trolley system, they controlled the water system, they controlled even the industries that came and went. So LA became that kind of place. So yeah, it is true. I can't imagine that if you talk about the High Line in New York, let's say, as an example of infrastructure that's been retrofitted, or the new theater in Hamburg, right? These are interesting anecdotes, but you can't come up with something as glamorous as the LA version, where you rewire a city economically. The ports now raise something like 1.2 or more billion dollars a day. They've dropped by 10% because of COVID, but because people still need that stuff, the ports aren't dying as fast, right, as some other industries. You can't say that about High Line in Manhattan. I mean, it's interesting that you can buy a $6 million apartment next to it, right? And I guess it's kind of cute to see a chocolate factory turn into a giant theater cake or something like that.
Just want to pick up.
But it's nothing. I don't think Hamburg hasn't been rewired by its infrastructure. So I think I never thought about that. I work a lot with layers, by the way. I produced a novel of layers on LA that was 1,000 images. It's called Bleeding Through Layers of Los Angeles. And it covers some of this earlier period. And it's coming out in a new edition through Germany, by the way, through Essen. And they found a way to get the software to work again, amazingly. Google couldn't.
Norman, I just want to.
The layers thing is a very interesting model for this culture, and not just for LA, but in general. So, so that's a really big question. Jasper always comes up with really big questions.
I just want to pick up on what you said about the sort of control of water systems. Actually, one image in my head is the one from Chinatown that probably most of us know. And actually, there's a really good question from Kay, and I think she can actually ask the question herself. now.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, hi, Kay.
Hi, Norman. Yeah, I was interested.
Pardon if I'm a little explosive, but I hope we've been following. Yes.
Not at all explosive. No, it's great. Thanks so much. I'll put my video on actually. Yeah, my question was about water supplies and droughts in the area of California, but how that's affected the shaping of LA in terms of rich and poor, because obviously the rich can take the hit and they pay the tax, whereas the poor possibly won't, water their gardens, but also the droughts that are being created or the dams that have burst in other areas of California as ramifications of getting water to LA. So I'm quite interested in how kind of the history of water as a form of movement through a city, therefore kind of mirroring walking, maybe.
Water is a huge issue. And now, by the way, the Chinatown story happened in 1906, not the 1930s. But cars looked very boring and people wore dull shirts. And it was a bad time to murder people. So they pushed it to the 30s because that's a better time for murder to take place. But so that means the problem of water goes back to the 1890s and 1905 and so forth. And it's been resolved and not resolved. So LA's had this water crisis coming for the last 30 years or 40 years. They've known that the Colorado River was drying up. The whole western end of America has known about this water crisis for a long time. They've been watching it coming. And then because of the growth of Nevada and Arizona and so on, they don't want to give up their water to LA very much, this kind of thing. And then the water from Northern California has been also diminishing, and people were dying of all the dust storms created by how dry it got. So they sued LA and LA had to fix it, So this is an ongoing problem that's reached epic proportion now because of the wildfires. They think so it's affecting Northern California more than people this year than LA, right? LA just got kind of orange for a few days, right? But there have been fires almost as bad 2 years before. But there is this continual issue as to what to do, right? One thing is that this segregation by class and money has not yet happened to the degree it will. In other words, I see it coming, right? People having their own cisterns, for example, or where people live and don't live, but it'll take a while to make the full adjustment. For the time being, LA has been able to more or less not have water shutdowns or shortages yet because they've had enough rain back and forth, but I think that's over now. So it is a huge crisis coming, and the solution is they have to harvest more of the water because the way they rebuilt the river, they're just not collecting enough. That's one thing that'll have to happen. I just don't see how LA will solve its water problems. It's another problem that's California and LA and the whole western part of the United States are facing a crisis of gigantic proportions. If not for Trump, it would be the biggest news of the year almost. So your question is completely right. It's subsumed by the fact that America might lose its constitution altogether. So it's kind of secondary news, but not really. So yes, I don't know how the entire area from the other side of the Rockies is going to adjust to this. I mean, LA, they hit 130 degrees in one part of California. 130 degrees is considered the limit of human habitation.
In terms of parts of the desert surrounding LA, like Mojave Desert, and you get this in other deserts like in Texas with Terra Lingua, you have these people living off the grid. And I feel like in the US, more so than let's say England and most European countries, there's this kind of urge of I don't know what percentage of the population, but to kind of just completely live by their own means. And I wonder with water shortages, with environmental changes, do you think that part of American psyche ideology is going the kind of like post-frontier style mixed with kind of libertarian will be more prevalent?
What's happening in the US is a lot of these areas have become suburban, right? I think the comparison in Europe would be those dry areas around the Mediterranean, all the way from Budapest down to Hungary, down to Greece and so forth, that have been suddenly desiccated beyond what they used to. When I was in Budapest a few years ago, 4 tour boats got dried up by the bridge. and they couldn't get down the river. There wasn't enough water for them. They got sunk in the mud right under a bridge in Budapest. And I was thinking, that's got to be a new deal. This has not happened before, I'm sure. And so I think the area around the Mediterranean in Europe is being hit also to some degree, and I'm sure North Africa as well. So there are many parts of the world that I just don't know. In the case of Southern California, they overbuilt areas that were fire zones and slide areas, as they call them, right? So first there's fire, and then when it rains, the slick is so poisonous it destroys the water system around it, or suddenly your building finally slips to a new zip code, slides down the hill. And so what's happened is they overbuilt in areas they shouldn't have, right? And the irony is that some of those areas are fairly wealthy, right? And some of the areas are near the near the agrarian wine growing, so on. Right? So they're poor. So there's poor and rich. So there's going to be a tremendous reordering, right, of neighborhood priorities and areas all over California for the next, I don't know, what do you think? 20 years? 20 years. You're young. 20 years, you can handle it. Me, 20 years, that's a long time. Right? So I'd say it's a 20-year adjustment, and we'll just see where it leads. But yes, it's an incredibly important question, and people are losing sleep over it, I'm sure.
Norman, Tim Durfee makes the...
Oh, Tim, hey.
Oh, you know each other. He makes the observation that in relation to what you've been talking about with Kay just now, that the working from home pandemic work patterns will only accelerate this phenomenon.
Which phenomenon?
I think is what Kay was talking about in relation to, I don't know, being off grid.
Yes. Oh, I see. So you'll be off grid, but on grid. You'll be the only person employed on the street because you're off the grid, but on the grid. Right? It's a grid. It's a grid, non-grid. It's a post-grid. Post-grid. A decolonized grid. Right. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, Tim and I would chat about this even before he was involved in this book that I wrote for about some of the other effects, because he's part of this complicated program in research and media design and so forth. And so it's an ongoing issue as to where the digital capitalist influence lies in real physical space, you know? And I think we've accelerated it. I think the COVID thing has added 10 years of accelerated time. We're 10 years ahead in that problem, whatever it might be. And I don't know. I mean, it still leaves the larger problem also, if I could change the question slightly, as to whether digital capitalism will ever make enough jobs. Manufacturing was terrible. It gave us world wars. It destroyed the planet. It murdered people, but it made a lot of jobs. I mean, it generated union jobs. And one wonders whether this new digital economy will simply automate us to death, right? And whether the problem behind all of it, all of these questions, is how much inequality can our systems handle? Because with inequality, you have more oligarchy, and you create basically a kind of emergent feudalism. You know, a feudal system, which is very, very bad on a nation state, pulls tax money out, this and that. So all sorts of questions, right? Everything is going to be, will we pull together something like an integrated nation state out of all this, right? Or will we simply zoom ourselves into some kind of granular oblivion, right? And it's become very clear. With COVID, we finally see what oblivion looks like. It's basically being in a shoebox, staring at everybody and talking together and saying, well, at least I don't have to wear a mask today, right? This kind of thing. So,
thinking about like being...
While all these problems are getting, the kind of problems that only a nation state could solve, right? So part of the problem is that the city of LA has no money to solve its water problems, really. It's too large. And it's already $600 million in deficit right now. That's a lot for a city. And they don't know how high it can go. But cities can't make money the way nations can, right? Nations can print money. So the big question is all over the place. So the Zoom thing is definitely going to change the patterns even further. But unless, I guess I'm old-fashioned 20th century enough to believe that the nation state is going to have to be strengthened in the US, certainly. I don't know, I guess in Europe it's a little better, except for the UK where I guess it's the Anglo-Saxon nightmare, right? The two Anglo-Saxon countries have screwed up terribly, right? But Germany too, I guess. Yeah, so just Germany. So we're all aware that all these questions.
I'm not German, by the way.
What?
I'm not German, by the way.
Oh, okay. Then that
So,
excuse me. Yeah.
I'm talking, when I'm now talking about states, then I would rather talk about another state, and I would talk about Switzerland, which is even probably more delicate and problematic.
Yes, yeah. The land of tax havens since the 18th century.
Right.
I mean, when they set up the tax havens between London and Switzerland, that's how they did it, right? The Swiss set it up. London took the money with them.
Norman, I'm wondering whether we've kind of, it feels like on our walk we've stopped for a coffee, and we've got a few other topics, which are great. But I'm kind of thinking that I might be ready to continue with the walk in LA now.
Yes, great.
And one of the things I was thinking of again was this relationship of physical space and infrastructure space with culture, and as we kind of move around LA, we see these sites disappearing. And I remember that not long ago you were talking about, is it the 5th bridge?
Oh yeah, there was a bridge.
Yeah,
a bridge was built right in the 1920s that attached East LA to downtown at a time when East LA was working class and not simply Latino. And the bridge was, I think it's 6th Street Bridge. And the bridge evolved in that very weird way because it pointed toward everything that was falling apart in Los Angeles. So you saw the river looking terrible, the same river that they used in Point Blank and in Terminator, this cemented nothingness. And then you saw East LA, which was being segregated from the city, policing, and it became this huge culture with art movements and this and that and so on. And then finally it was discovered that there was a crisis in cement, which was part of the key to all mid-century modernism. That even in the early stages, they used the cement from the river, which had some pollutant in it, and the cement was actually developing a cancer and dying off. And so the bridge was actually caving in on itself. So they had to rebuild a new bridge. And then they rebuilt a new bridge to make it look like a theme park. So then they have a theme park version of what had been an ethnographic bridge. And it became this funny story, how it died, all the things that were thrown in the river with it, and so on. It became an art show.
It became an art show. And then I remember there was an exhibition.
Yes, there was.
Almost a kind of homage to the 6th Bridge, which, as Max points out in the chat, suffered from concrete cancer. But the issue was also that it was a site that was of particular interest to artists, but it was a site for also mainstream media, not least Greece was the shot there, wasn't it? So John Travolta wins the race just as he pulls ahead, going under the 6th Bridge, right? So it's
Greece more than the other films.
Yeah, I mean, it's the one that everyone remembers. It may not be the best one. I'm sure it's not. But the point with that is that, you know, again, it's another example of this kind of shared cultural imaginary that really focuses in on kind of and around the infrastructure space of LA.
I guess we ask another question. When you redo an old neighborhood that had its own, shall we say, ruin and recovery and evolution and so forth, and then you clean it up and almost make it look as if no one's moved in yet. or give it a kind of themed scripted spaces environment? Have you not suburbanized it rather than urbanized it? Have you turned it into something that in a strange way is very artificial and not organic? And that's the 6th Street Bridge apparently has been turned into that. It looks fine. It has lots of nice Hispanic style references, but the end result is that it looks kind of like a place for $20 or $30 hamburgers, right? It doesn't look like a place for burrito trucks to gather and local music to happen. And so it's probably going to be like that. And I think many cities are suffering from this over suburbanization of cultural spaces. And part of that is because of tourism and who knows what else. And LA, of course, invented it. That's where Disneyland came from. So LA is really, really too good at it, right? So a lot of these little towns that have come back in the archipelago LA do have a kind of, you know, cutesy quality, right? And they look inhabited, but inhabited by people who have left the suburbs and moved in or something. We have to understand that the suburban civilization did leave a mark, and it could be that that's partly why cities look in a strange way glossy, like a wallpapered version of themselves. But I have a feeling that the COVID crisis may tear some of the wallpaper off. We may see something interesting. The end result is it costs too much money for artists to be in. The museums cost too much money, and it mostly sponsors very, very expensive art for really rich people, right? And so that bridge was turned into an annex to the arts district, rather than into an evolving organic neighborhood, right? And I mean, East London, I don't know, you have to tell me the story as to which part of East London has been suburbanized while it's been urbanized. Which part of East London still remains somehow that I don't know, pub-oriented place, or whatever you want to call it. So I think the new stage is going to, the layer that globalization and late suburbanism created for cities is probably going to end. But what happens next, right? Because it's going to be remarkable. I suppose culture is going to get smaller, right? I guess that's what's going to happen.
Well, I guess we've got, is it November the 3rd on the horizon?
Oh, yes.
I mean, the question of what happens next.
It's the most important election since the Civil War, but one has to remember the Civil War had Lincoln as president. I mean, Biden is charming as a kind of Boy Scout leader, right? He's charming as a kind of friendly uncle, but he's not Lincoln, you know, he's not FDR. So we'll have to see, but the whole world can hold its breath, because if this psychopath, right, the sociopath, I guess, from Queens with no taste and no ethics anyone could find, actually winds up winning, or it'll spread around the world, the effect of it. So we're only weeks away from an event that our grandchildren will ask us about. I'll say, where were you that week when that thing happened? Were you there in 1968? I mean, it's strange to be on the very, very edge of an election with tremendous implications. The US right now is the biggest news story in the world, at least for the next week, right? And that's saying a lot, because there are wars going on, and there are crises going on in Central Asia and in Iraq and Turkey and Greece and so forth. There's really world problems going on, and Europe is a mess. It's getting its new, the crisis in Europe because of the new COVID business is complicated. And I think Europe can handle it, I guess. I don't know, what do I know? But the US, it's extraordinary. Everything we're talking about in 2 months will be different. Can you imagine? Not a single sentence will be the same. Well, you always know you're in history when every day feels like a month.
People queuing.
I guess. Sorry,
I was just going to say that, you know, the images of people queuing for hours to vote is a reason for optimism. And I just wondered, is that what we're seeing in Los Angeles, in the neighborhoods?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, and we're seeing also younger people are voting, which is, but the polls are confusing and no one's telling the truth. People getting fed up with polls, I think. I think they'll just give any answer now. So, yeah, I'm going to vote for, you know, I'm going to vote for him because he's dead. You know, it's okay, we'll write that down. I'm not sure if the polls are quite accurate. People are just going through this syndrome of exhaustion every day, and so yes, it's interesting. But yes, the voter suppression is not strong in LA. We just dropped it in the box. That was nothing. And California is the socialist sovereign republic. What's happened out of this problem is that LA is more like a city state, almost like Venice in the Middle Ages, and it operates almost by itself, much more than it used to. And California is almost like a sovereign nation, because not only are there going to be hubs in cities, they're going to be hubs in the United States. The United States will probably break apart in a de facto way into 3 or 4 different countries, all operating under the same flag. It'll become more like Germany, but more so. Germany even more so. It'll become more and more federated, probably, unless some miracle happens, you know, where there's this wave of national integrative policy, and people, I mean, there are 10 scenarios. 9 of them are pretty terrible. 1 of them is quite wonderful. So I'd like to vote for the wonderful one, but I stay up literally having nightmares every night, because that's not the one I'm dreaming of. So we'll have to see.
We've got an observation from Kay, and so I'm just going to pause that.
I'm going to, by the way, the notes I left you, Jasper, of all the things I'm not talking about today, you can send that to other people, so they can see what it is I didn't get around to talk about. But what's the difference? We're getting somewhere, right? Yes. Okay. Hi again.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you about how grassroots organizations, maybe over the last, I don't know, 40 years, like the developments or the shifts back and forth between progressive and less progressive grassroots organizations have like shaped the landscape. Because at the moment, the only 2 I'm aware of from across the world is ones that have become kind of through social media quite well known, so Gangster Gardener and Compton Cowboys, which are obviously like just 2 examples that may not even be the most grassroots. But I wondered what you knew of in LA that kind of shifts how you think of the space or the city.
Well, LA is relatively sedate compared to other cities in other parts of the country. But I think what has happened is part of this feudal condition that I'm talking about is that it generates a kind of vigilante attitude. And there are parts of LA and parts of Central California that do have these pockets of white supremacists. On the other hand, you also do have signs of some degree of solidarity, right? But then is diversity and solidarity, will they go together? We'll have to see. Everyone's in favor of diversity, but everyone's worried that there may not be solidarity. And unless it's an organized diversity, how on earth are we supposed to correct issues, not just water, but everything else that is so huge that will require a kind of shared, right? Shared community, particularly people of your generation or your era, I would prefer, right? Who really have no choice. You're gonna have to fix it, not because you even want to, because you have no choice. And so you're wondering, is there enough anchoring stuff? Like what happened to the Occupy movement, which is strong in LA and everywhere else? Where did these people go? I have to say, next door to me, there's a member of the original Occupy group, and he's been going camping for the last year. He likes going camping, but then you think, shouldn't this be the time to take your know-how into? So we'll have to see. I think overall, there's reason to hope, right, that these grassroots groups can organize, partly through social media, and it's not just the right wing, right, who've been organized. But I do think there's a possibility that there will be some moments of violence, in the next year in the United States. I just don't know where. Not as likely in LA, but why not? You know, I mean, could be anywhere. But my guess is some other places. And I don't know how far they'll go, but there are signals that the United States, which has a history of vigilante actions since the 17th century. So it's not a new thing. I mean, the United States has been a kind of lopsided, granulated mess before. It's baked in, you might say. So I see some coordination, but I don't know if there's enough yet, right? But maybe this election will generate the alliances that are needed. Does that make sense? And
yeah, I mean, I just mentioned Compton Cowboys because I was thinking in terms of walking through a city and how you're saying that the city is maybe shifting to allow that Compton Cowboys, regardless of whether they end up being more commercial than I like to think they are. They look after horses in the middle of Compton, which is supposed to be, you know, historically is known as being this kind of poorer neighborhood. And then they take their horses and they ride through their neighborhood and they go to work. And I just wonder how that kind of like seeing something like that shifts what you imagine your city can be, like when that just appears on your street without expecting it.
Well, I think it depends on the DNA of an area. For example, there's the Appalachian area that goes back to the 17th century. There's the American South that isn't just a planter economy, but also had a lot of indenture. There's the American West that was filled with this kind of cowboy culture, right? California and LA specifically did not want to be part of the West. They hated being considered part of the West because they felt the West is where you get ripped off. They take out your mineral rights and then they leave you dead, right? So LA's tried to be an alternative, like a kind of farm town with good values, or a modernist version of a city looking to the sunset, you know, looking to the sunrise.
Say that the Compton Cowboys,
the myth of freedom.
The myth of freedom
is quickly unraveling. And well, just as
always been unraveling,
but just before it unravels completely, I just think we should probably start wrapping up, and we don't want it to unravel completely while we're all here, so we still can keep hold of that kind of myth that we associate with LA, and let's hope that it can exist in some form in the future.
It's very strong. I mean, LA's myths are not as much about a cowboy culture, but it's very much a myth about having your own house, having your own backyard, having some kind of middle class fantasy of yourself, and it was a very, very Protestant myth, right? A kind of city on the hill, but that's been so completely changed. I think LA is almost an LA version of New York 100 years ago. Okay. Put it that way, right? That it has this uncertainty factor, and I have so many weird stories like that cowboy business you're talking about. LA is filled with these vigilante events, but the center of the state, as you go further north, has even more of it, and other parts of the United States really have a lot of it, right?
Well, I don't see the Compton Cowboys as vigilante because maybe you don't know, but so I mean, usually you think of the Marlboro adverts if you're from Europe, and the cowboy is white and is kind of Republican, and there's these ideas we have, whereas the Compton Cowboys are all black, so they're already not fitting the image of kind of so yeah. I mean, I'm not saying they can't be bad people, like we could all be bad people, but they don't fit that idea. So they're a different kind of image of what a cowboy can be.
But it's coming out of commercial culture, not out of the cattle industry or something like that.
Yeah, that I don't know because I've never met them, but they have this a whole thing where you watch videos of them looking after the horses, cleaning the horses, but in the middle of the city, and then they take them on these walks, and then you follow them through the city because they have cameras on their head. So you're traveling through the city at the pace of a horse, and cars are slowly moving around.
I'll give this answer to be brief but succinct in some way, right? In the United States, the idea of the rural has always been very strange. Some mining towns see themselves as rural. rural has a very weird relationship between the frontier and the coastal towns and so forth. So they're constantly redefining what rural means, right? So the idea of black rural cowboys going through a place where there never were horses that much, right, is interesting. We're always redefining things. That's why the Western movie was so easy for Americans to move into. But we have a very strange, ironic relationship with the rural, which has a lot to do with the suburbs in America and so on. It's easily an hour and a half conversation.
Well, talking of which, I'm gonna have to stop this now, just because we're almost at an hour and a half, and I'm aware that it's Sunday evening. You know, people are clearly probably not wanting to leave, but needing to leave, and you know, I just think that we've had a great walk with you, Norman.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you.
To indicate what I didn't get a time to talk about.
We'll find a way of circulating the notes, won't we?
People want to know. Yeah. If they want to see what it is I didn't get around to talk about.
And you know, I think probably it's really just for me to say thank you again, and let's try and meet up after November 3rd. Hopefully with a drink to celebrate.
Make an oath that this is part of a discourse we're trying to develop, and that there is a reason to do it, and we'll have to find out what the reason is, but not consider this something between lunch and dinner, but it's actually something towards something larger. And I really feel that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing it. And I see I'll say Kay's smile is similar to other people's smiles. This is what their era needs. So we have to at least provide them with more of it and help them, and they'll help us, right? So it's in honor of what can be done next. So I'd like to end with that note, because that there used to be, I'll end with my favorite radio statement. There was one radio show I used to love to watch. It was Studs Terkel watch. See, I could see his face. It turned out he was Jewish, but he sounded like a Polish guy from the stockyards. He was this great character, and I couldn't make up his voice. But he always ended with one statement. I would listen to I wouldn't remember what the show was. I just waited for Studs to end. He always ended by saying, take it easy, but take it. I thought, oh, great. How do I do that? So this time, I guess we have to do that, right? So until later, and enjoy your dinner.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.